Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. My name is Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on November 9th with Bob Taylor. He will be giving a presentation on new training and learning tools in the Family History Guide. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on researching New England town records from the 1600s to the present. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James has over 40 years' experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog. He has served as a family history volunteer for 18 years and has presented at expos and conferences around the US, Canada, and Europe. He is a member of the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James is a professional photographer and has 7 children, 34 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. And we'll now turn the time over to James.
Okay, for today's webinar, we're going to be talking about researching New England town records from the 1600s to the present. This is an interesting topic for people who are obviously for 2 qualifications. One, you need to understand enough about genealogy to be aware of town records and find them. And the second part of that is, of course, that you have to have relatives who lived in New England if you're going to use the New England records. But that's interesting because estimates about 10% or so of the United States, of the population of the United States is descendant from people in New England. Often we think of New England as being English or English speaking. However, over time, of course, the most immigrants to the United States spoke German. Germany is the place, well, whatever the countries that speak German, not Germany itself, were the first place in being the most immigrants into the United States. And second place is from Ireland. And so it's just the New England after the initial years of population from England became a pathway for later people coming to the United States and to America first up to 1776, obviously. Well, let's get going on the record sets. So the record sets began actually before the Pilgrims got off the boat. So back in 1620, with the arrival of the colonists, establishment of the Plymouth colony, their records begin immediately. And those records have a variety of different subjects. Of most of those, as you'll see from the copy here of a transcribed book from 1620 to 1651, were deeds and etc., meaning and other documents. The deeds are extremely useful because they, in a sense, chronicle every single one of the people who came and obtained property. Now, that wasn't all of the colonists, because some colonists did not get property, but it's a very good opening into what kinds of the people were there. And the next set of documents that become extremely important are the probate records, because the people who got the property initially died, and their property had to be transferred to their heirs. So those documents were a almost complete chronicle of all of the people who lived in New England. So understand that these records were kept in each town, but we can also see many of these records today because they've been transcribed and found in books or available online with its digital copies on various websites. And that's part of what I'll talk about as we go along, that where and how you get to these records. Understanding what their records are. The records are records of the proceedings, primarily the proceedings of the town councils. Those were the governing bodies of each of the towns. Obviously, as the colonies developed, they became organized into counties, and later, of course, when the United States came along, they were put into states. But initially, the way that the counties were maintained and the government of the counties was focused on the individual town councils. And these records are the records of their proceedings. Now, the proceedings, as I'll mention in just a few minutes, are quite expansive. They will take in a lot of different subjects, and sometimes things which you probably were not aware were even available on older records going back into the 1600s. There's a perception among, let's say, people, even genealogists, that of course it's accurate that as you go into the past, that the record sets become more difficult to find, and they become more difficult to access. Well, that isn't necessarily the case with records in New England. In New England, the records are generally available back to the point at which the individual towns were created and the counties were created. And that goes back to the early 1600s. And so the number of records is phenomenally large, and the number of and their usefulness has increases, because as you go back in time, they really are the people who are keeping track of all of the records that are of all the people and all the proceedings of what's happening in that town, which reflects on the people themselves. So they can include all of these things. They're not necessarily, they depend heavily on the talent or ability of the town clerk, the person who was responsible for making the record and preserving the record. And so that is a major issue in how valuable they become. If you had a really bad town clerk, if you had a really good town clerk, then that was good too. Also, it also reflects on the handwriting of the town clerk, because all these records were written out by hand, page after page after page. Fortunately, they're more or less in chronological order. Occasionally, the town clerk will make a partial index or some kind of an index of some of the records. And so there's ways to work through them. But by and large, when you're doing the town records, you're just sitting there reading just the story of the town. And I found that going back through the records frequently after I've done the initial reading is to go back through, I find more information. And of course, you may be searching for something that isn't there. In other words, you may think that your person lived in that town, and it turns out that they lived in an adjoining town, or they did not at all, that they weren't at all part of that area. And reading a lot of the records will not necessarily, town records will not necessarily exclude the fact that the person, or say that prove the fact that the person was not there. It just might mean that they weren't prominent enough or didn't do anything that would have been noted by the town clerk. So that's a little bit difficult. The first and most valuable things, obviously, are birth, marriage, and death dates and places. Those are in no other part of the United States are there records that go back this far, consistently going back into the 1600s. That doesn't mean that the town clerk was aware of all the births and all the marriages and all the deaths, but it does give a substantial amount of information about the people in the town. And sometimes if there's no death date recorded, you can tell when they stopped paying taxes that they probably either moved out or they died. They also have details about the ancestors' professions, associates, contributions to the community, assignments that they had from the town. A lot of times, for example, the town councils were in charge of the utilities in a sense of the town. If there were wells to be dug or if there were roads to be built. And very often the members of the town, the citizens of the town, were given specific duties to provide so much roadway or maintain their property in a certain way. And so all of these things are very much involved in the detail, the really extraordinary detail of these town records. And you have records of burials, cemeteries, appointments, earmarks, estrays, freemen's oaths, land records, mortgages, name changes, care of the poor, school records, surveys, tax lists, town meeting minutes, and voter registrations. That just is a start. Just about anything else that transpired in the town was written down in the town record. And so you have a almost complete chronological record of everything that happened. Now, there's a couple of words there you might not be familiar with, and I can help you a little bit here with some definitions we might need to get into. First of all, earmarks. It may seem a little bit cruel today. I guess my position would be it's a lot less cruel to the animal than branding, but they don't do that much branding nowadays. They most use ear tags, and they use like this particular animal, cow, has a earmark, which is the part of the ear that's been cut out, and that's done in a particular way, and that's what they've called earmarks. So as you're going through the town records, you may find lists of all the earmarks of all the people in the town. So they've registered their earmarks so that people know if they that they own a certain animal. And this was helpful because occasionally what would happen in these circumstances with these early towns is that the animals would be all kept in common. They didn't necessarily have the facilities to handle all of the animals individually in each farm. So there's often times when they were commingled in different pastures or things like that. And then it was possible to identify the cows before they were actively marked with branding, which came later. An estray is a domestic animal that is lost or found wandering, especially if the owner is unknown. The records of the estrays are not uncommon. It happened quite frequently. And there's an amazing amount of information about the people and the families and everything else from reports of what happened and trying to get the animal returned to the proper owner. The oath of a free man was a loyalty pledge that new members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were required to take. And that began in the 1630s. And the oath itself was first printed in 1639 by Stephen Day, and it's believed to be the first document printed in the United States. That's the good news. The bad news is that nobody has a copy of it. They have some transcriptions, but they don't have an original copy. And this one happens to be a forged copy of the oath made by Mark Hoffman. And if you lived in Utah for some time or are aware of what goes on here, you'll realize that he was a very infamous forger who ended up in Utah State Prison. So there's a question you can ask, because if these are such valuable records and they have all this information, why don't more genealogical research know about it and use the town records? I think that's a very valuable question to ask. And I think it's kind of a question you'd have to ask yourself is, why don't you use the records? Why is there some reason why you're not using this vast resource? Okay, so here are the reasons. Here are some of the reasons why they have not been recognized, have not been used very frequently. If you talk to some genealogical researchers who are involved heavily in New England in research, and of course they'll say, of course you use town records. It's like everybody uses town records. Well, that's not really the case. And from the condition of the FamilySearch family tree, and especially in New England, it's obvious that people have no concept of what they're doing and are ignoring town records. So here's the first problem: is the condition is rather spotty. Sometimes you can read it very clear and very easy to read, and sometimes you're putting together the information and not exactly sure what you're reading because you only have a part of the entry. The second, probably most, probably maybe the most important reason people don't use, or researchers don't use town records, is because they're difficult to read. Let's just face it, that's old handwriting. And in the 1600s, it was significantly different than current handwriting. If you're doing genealogical research, eventually you will confront this, unless you simply say, I don't do research before 1800 or something like that, or 1900, then you're basically limiting what kind of research you will do. But obviously, if you're working your way backwards. Now, your question would be, what happens if you, the colonists, the people who came to New England initially, did not simply forget what they learned in Europe, in England and Scotland and Wales and the other places where they were primarily coming from. Their handwriting is the same as the handwriting in England, and it is English. That's it. And it's only slightly different than Scottish or Welsh handwriting. And it's very similar to handwriting on the continent at the same time periods, because handwriting was used internationally to communicate. And so therefore people used a handwriting it's called, the way that it's written, were taught, and people learned how to write. And so their writing reflects the amount of their education. Now, one thing you'll learn very quickly is that most of the people who are contained in these records do not know how to write. And it is very common that you will find a will signed by an X, by the declarant with an X, or any other of the legal documents, deeds and everything else. There's still going to be only a few people in the village or town that can transcribe and make, create all these documents that they needed to transmit property, purchase and sell, buy and sell property, and all the other things, business things that had to go on in the community. Oh, and of course, before you get too far, you understand that a lot of the people who depend solely on indexed records are even if they know they exist, they're not inclined to try to work their way through them. And so another problem, of course, is that very few of them are indexed. If they are indexed, the indexes are integral to the work itself. In other words, the town clerk will have made an index for specific reasons. If there is an index, there's probably an index to like the probate records or the deeds or something of that nature, rather than a complete index of all the records and all the names. So it's there are a few helps, but it's not. But the major issue here is that the only way you get the information is to sit down and start with page 1 and read the record. Now, how do you narrow that down? What do you do to well, the records themselves are chronological usually. It doesn't necessarily be the case, because the town clerk may have started some records and then flipped up a few pages in their book and written other records and then come back. So there's kind of movement occasionally back and forth within the record. And so an index would really help. Well, today in our world with artificial intelligence and handwriting recognition, it's possible that in the not too distant future, all of these town records will have been transcribed by the AI and turned into indexed or searchable records. So right now, they're not necessarily searchable. The ones that are transcribed obviously are, and as I mentioned initially, there are indexes to some of those records. So it's helpful to try and find out if there may be, for example, a copy of the original handwritten records, which are which are fortunate if there are. But even if there are not the records available, there may have been a transcript made of the records before they were lost or became unavailable. And so it's always helpful to do your research at all levels, to search on the internet, search in local and other sources such as societies and historical societies, genealogical societies, state libraries, and all the other places, university special collections. And I'll come back and re-emphasize that point in the future. Even when the original copies of the records are attached to sources and memories, they're frequently ignored. So here's a will and a codicil, which means an additional part of the will, something that was added on after the first will was written. And it's of a yeoman, and a yeoman means he was a landowner. So that's probably why this particular document was created. This will was to transfer his ownership upon his demise, his death. And so here's the record. The question is, why would you read through this? Well, if you found this, the first thing you would want to know is, did the person who put that there read it properly and get the information correct out of it? So you need to go through and verify what it says. And did he understand what the terminology and who actually got the property or who didn't get the property, and what was awarded to each one of the heirs, and who were the heirs and how were they entered? So there was a question that came up a couple of days ago. Apparently there was a will, and they were asking me a question about this will, and they said that everyone in the will, the sons were named and they were given property, and the daughters, married daughters, were named with their spouses' names, and then at the end there was another daughter who was named, who was not did not have a spouse, did not show that she had a married name. The question was asked, what kind of inference would you take from that? And the answer would be, well, she wasn't married, or she was married and they didn't like the guy, or keep going on. There's lots of different things. And perhaps if you continue to read in the rest of the town record or the other information about the town, You may find that she actually was married and that for whatever reason, her father did not want to name his son-in-law. So where are all these records? Where do they come from? Where do they go? Well, they're town records. So when you have a town in New England, you will find town records, references to them. They may be in collections, and I will go through some of the major places that it's possible to find these records. Okay, so here, for example, is the research, is a search in the FamilySearch .org website for town records under subjects and under keywords. And in this case, what we have is a list of every single record on FamilySearch that has town records. And if you look closely at the top of this record, you'll see something interesting. And that is that there are 21,481 town records in New England. Well, primarily. So what we have here is this massive amount of possible research area, and from each of the towns, and you'll see dates on the records. They're cataloged differently around, and the times, sometimes they cover more years. For instance, you'll find records like they're on the background, the Bridgewater, Massachusetts from 1656 to 1681, and then there'll be another set, and sometimes they're missing, and sometimes they're not available directly or haven't been indexed or whatever. So it's the usual things that you find when you start working with the original source records, that they're not necessarily as organized and as easily to find as you would wish they to be. I have to acknowledge this, that there are some researchers out there that are cautious about using the FamilySearch.org website because they've had a bad experience with the family tree. They're concerned about constant changes being made to individuals, and there are no sources, and it's unreliable. And that's some of that is merited, and but the point is not that. The point is that often, well, there's another issue, and that's most of the sources that are cited most commonly are referring to secondary sources, such as indexes, rather than the original records. This is just the reality of a user-created family tree, and it's not a problem with the website. It's a problem with the data and the information that's being put in the website. But you're not doing your research into the FamilySearch family tree. That's not where the research is, where you direct your research. You direct your research to the vast number of more than 21,000 family records in just town records on the FamilySearch website, and that will undoubtedly increase over time. So if you're concerned about the changes on the FamilySearch.org website, just build your family tree on some other website like Ancestry, or on your computer with a program that runs on your desktop computer like Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest, or MyHeritage has one. There's a Family Tree Maker. There's a whole bunch of other programs out there that you can use, and no one's going to make changes to your website. But I would then just inform you of the fact that you're losing a lot of advantages of doing research if you just ignore the whole website because you don't like the family tree. So this is kind of an interesting situation. I can predict in the future, if I were going to be in that kind of position, I would say that the issue of the problems with the FamilySearch family tree will fairly quickly become moot, unimportant, because of artificial intelligence and the way that the that the information will be available. Important to understand and look for transcriptions when you're doing research into these town records. The operative word is town, city, town, village, whatever it is, community. And as long as they were recognized as a town and organized as a town in New England with the town council, it is inevitable that there were records, and the records may be sitting in handwritten form in the town clerk's office today, back to the original records. They may still be there. They may have been digitized and they may not have been digitized, but they may also have been transcribed because over the years, there have been genealogically talented people who went through and wrote, copied out all of the information in certain records and certain books during time periods and published them. And so these books are out there, and there's a vast number of these books also. And they're the ones we rely on because they are actual transcripts. In other words, even the language and the spelling of the original are there. Now, there's another use for these books that may not be obvious, and that the use for these books is if you go look at the original documents, now you've got this book, now you go look at the original documents, here you have a transcription. So you can use your transcription to learn how to read the original documents. And it's very helpful if you are working online and you find an original will or something and you just say, I just can't read this. I don't understand what it's saying. And I just don't know how I'm going to get into this. Is to go back and see if you can find another will that's been transcribed online from that place. And it's very possible that that's happened. And if you did, you can then have a probably 60 to 70% of all of the information will be, all the words and those phrases and everything will be exactly the same in the two wills if they're from approximately the same time period. And so you're going to get all those words, and then that'll show you what the handwriting, you'll be able to learn how to read the handwriting. That's one way, by the way, that I learned how to read this old handwriting, was to look up the records and get the originals and use the transcriptions so that I could see, oh, that's what it says. Well, okay. So now when I get to the next time and I look at it, then I can basically understand what it is that it says. And the books that are available, if they're available in some instances, a lot of times they're searchable. If they're transcribed, if they're digitized and they're online, they may be searchable word for word, like these books, which are on archive.org, that can be searched. You can go in here and look for names, and it will show you every name of that person in the book, or it will any other phrase or anything you want to search on. It will point out every single instance of that and have it marked all through the book. So there's some real advantages, of course, if you find one of these copies of these records, because they are very important. Now, the question would come up, and inevitably the question comes up and says, even though I have this transcription, should I be looking for the original record? And my answer is always yes. There may be a lot more that was not transcribed, and you should have it. You should go and see if the original record. Now, one reason that these records may have been transcribed is that the originals were scheduled to be thrown away, and that they weren't going to keep them anymore. Once they were transcribed, they no longer wanted to keep the originals. I mean, that's a question that happens continually from genealogists about the digitization of their records. So I digitized all my records. Which one shall I keep and which ones do I need to throw away? Well, I've been going through that process now for about 40 plus years. And I've thrown away a huge number of documents, but I also have a huge number left. And so I'm in the process now of going back through them. But that process is what happened with these books sometimes. And so that the originals may no longer be available, no matter where you look. Okay, so you can always just look for them on Google and look for them under a variety of names. You may want to look under vital records. You can also look directly, and everything on the archive.org, right, which if you're not aware of the archive.org, is now easily the largest freely available library of material in the entire world. And so this is, and is it a genealogy site? No, but it has enough genealogy on it to make it larger than some of, not all of the genealogy websites. It certainly has more books and published material than any other. So here are ways of finding the information, and this particular search for Rhode Island records brought up everything that was sitting on the Internet Archive. So that's one way of approaching it. Of course, that just postpones the need to learn how to read the records and to read them completely, because even if you have the book, you're still going to have to read through it. Now, what about if the books? They may have created an index. And so that is another reason why there's other avenues, other ways of getting into this information. It's very helpful. And if you do find this on this particular book or any book on archive.org, then as I mentioned, you find a way on that program to search the whole book word for word and mark every single page that has the search term on it. So it's an amazing website that's very useful and just is the one that you should be looking at consistently when you're doing research in any place in the world. Okay, so here are some additional ideas for discovering the town records. If you go onto FamilySearch or to Ancestry or some of the other websites that may have some town records on them, and I'll mention a few, there are there's always more. There are always more records that have not been digitized and are sitting someplace to go look at. So, well, the first thing you want to do is to plan. If you've done your search online, and what you've found is that the records are sitting in the town repository or town or a historical society or wherever, and that they haven't been digitized. So you may just have to plan a research trip to find all the available records. So, and unfortunately, this is not available to everyone. It's not a way that that most of the researchers would take the time or have the resources to do. But and the other problem, of course, is that finding these records may not be a matter of getting there one day and having one day to find the records and then having to leave again. You may have to spend weeks and even months in those repositories to get all the information out of the records you're looking for. So my caution is to do careful online searches first, to know what you already have online and what's available. Next is to look for historical society record collections. This is the Rhode Island Historical Society, and it has 25,000 museum objects, 100,000 printed books, 110,000 photographs, etc. 1,100 manuscript collections measuring over 7,000 linear feet. When you begin to look at this, the collections that are housed by just this one Rhode Island Historical Society, and there's other historical societies in every one of the states. And in fact, historical societies probably in all 50 states. I know there are historical societies in every state in the Union. And the information they have is usually very large, voluminous. And it's ignored because nobody takes the time to go sit there and go through it and learn what there is and to do whatever they need to do to get access to the records. In most of these cases, it requires you to join the historical society to get access, or the genealogical society. And so that is one way to get more information. And you could do this remotely. For instance, if you joined the State Historical Society and you lived someplace else, that may give you access to having somebody on site who will do research for a fee. Or it may give you access to digitized records that are not available elsewhere. So those are the kinds of things that you need to look into. And this is what I read a little bit about earlier about 100,000 printed books and photographs. And here's a list of every US state historical society and museums. It's on Wikipedia. And so you can just go down through here, and these are all linked to the Historical Society. So there's somewhere to go start and somewhere to start to talk to people, and don't minimize the effect of what happens here. Just one short kind of illustration. One of my friends came to me years ago and said that he was looking for his relative, I believe it was a great uncle, who had lived in southern Arizona, and in Arizona, and he was a miner in a place called Bisbee, Arizona, with a big mine there. And he said, well, I just can't find anything out about this guy at all, nothing. And I said, well, here, I've got a suggestion. Call this. There, I know there's a courthouse in Bisbee because it's the county seat. So go call them up. Ask them if anybody knows anything that might help you with your ancestor, who was apparently a miner in the mining operation. Anyway, so he did. A couple of weeks or a week or so later, he came back to me and said, I called the courthouse. They said, call this person. That person said was the head of their historical society for the mine. And they said, yes, we've got those records. And he sent me the whole packet of everything about my ancestor, his pay grade, his records, everything about him. So this was just a way to get through. And I think we spend a lot of times now as genealogists looking at the records when we should be talking to the people and finding out where the information that they may already have, and we may be able to find, having difficulty finding. I suggest if you're serious about doing research in New England, you should be a member of the New England Genealogical Society. So there's just nothing that I can say that doesn't. And here's an interesting thing: FamilySearch is American Ancestors, which is the website, is a partner program with FamilySearch. However, only a small percentage of the records on American Ancestors are available through the free website. So if you're serious about it, I'd suggest you want to get a membership. And before you get a membership, obviously, go search on the website and see what kinds of records are available and the kinds of things that might be helpful to you. Another one is the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. Now, the Mayflower Society has its own library in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and there are their resources here are books that are in other libraries. There's a set of books called the Silver Books, and the Silver Books has 5 generations of all of the 53 people who survived the first year on land from the and through the staying on the boat for the first winter, mostly, and they're exhaustively extensive. It's verified, sourced, absolutely with an obsession of accuracy with the General Society of the Mayflower descendants. And so if you think you're a descendant of the Mayflower and you don't know about the Silver Books, then you're simply wasting your time. Because here you have 5 generations from their descendants, and you don't have to trace it all back, and you don't have to go back and try and correct it all, because it's if it, of course, it's been changing every day, but it's basically not it shouldn't be changing, because the information is not controversial, and there's nothing missing. Anything's missing, it's not available. It's just end of story as far as what's available from for the Mayflower. They spent over 100 years getting this information together. And also there's the Daughters of the American Revolution. They are a wonderful source for information, and it gets you started into the citations and the records that may be possible. And they have a lot of records and a lot of information in their organization. And the other repositories that are available and include state and local genealogical societies, as I've alluded to, historical societies I've talked about, libraries, and university special collections libraries. Larger universities, most universities have a library, a major library. And part of that library is always the special collections. And they may have some of these old records in their special collections. As you go around, they may not have been gathered all into the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and they may not be all parts of, they may be in one of the other historical societies, but they also may be in the university special collections libraries. So these are all different places that are readily searchable. You can find out if they exist by doing searches for the town that your police people came from, or the county where they came from. And just again, make sure that you read through the entire town record. Every page could contain helpful information. They didn't put all the information in one place in these records. There's not a section for probates and another section for births and deaths and another section for whatever. It's a narrative flow of information that runs through the whole history of the town. So this is something that you'll find is challenging, but it's worth the effort, because it contains so much information. So the more you look, the more you'll find. It's inevitable. If you keep searching, if you keep looking for the records, you'll find. And I guess the problem here sometimes is exhaustion from the amount of information that's available. It's sometimes after you've spent hours and hours and hours reading through one town record, it sometimes becomes disheartening to find out that your people may have lived in the adjoining town and there's another record you need to read. So that's the inevitability of genealogical research. And I would just suggest that it's what we do, and it's how it's done. And so I don't apologize for it, because I think that it's very valuable. If you have any questions, you might want to put them in the chat, and we'll take all those questions as just in 1 minute here. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. Let's see now. Can you get Q&A and the chat? Just put in your question. What's the line of demarcation between AATMS and DAR? There is none. It's American Ancestors and the Mayflower Society, which is the society of the descendants of the Mayflower, the daughters of the American Revolution, are individual organizations, and what they collect is what they collect. And they really, it's just a matter of who got the information. So you're going to be able to find some, it's not necessarily unusual to find overlapping information in each of the three. And there are a lot more organizations besides these three. These are just the three most prominent ones. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you for tuning in today.
All right, thank you so much, James. We'll go ahead and close. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on November 9th with Bob Taylor. He will be giving a presentation on new training and learning tools in the Family History Guide. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.